In the name of God, hello everybody. This is session 12 of your syntax lesson. As you know, in the previous session, I talked about the binding theory, which consists of three kind of principles. Principle number A talks about the reflexive, pronouns, which I talked about the condition of reflexive, pronouns in the previous session. And I talked about the antecedent, the binding domain, and some other conditions like locality conditions in the previous session. In this session, again, I want to talk about the principle A, the reflexive. As I told you, in each domain for reflexive pronoun, we need a kind of subject or big subject. For example, look at this example. Poirot believes that himself is the best detective. You see here we have a kind of reflexive himself here, so it needs a kind of antecedent, but its antecedent is in another sentence, above sentence, like this, so there is no locality condition, so this is ungrammatical. So the I node, this is IP, inflection node of tense clauses, is specified for the feature plus tense and plus agreement. I told about these features in the previous sessions. The features of each I node, which consist of the tense and agreement. Agreement encodes the agreement properties of the subject. Okay, it contains the number, for example, and the person features of the subject. In other words, agreement in inflection, I, picks up the nominal features of the subject. This equation between agreement and the subject has led Chomsky to propose that agreement is like the subject. In order to distinguish agreement with its subject-like properties from the MP in the subject position, Chomsky refers to agreement, okay, of finite clauses as subject or big subject. So when there is a inflection in each sentence, in each finite sentence, so we have a kind of agreement. Agreement with what? With subject. So if we we have a kind of agreement features, so we have a kind of subject, big subject. According to our discussion so far, so all finite clauses seem to function as binding domain for reflexives. Why? Because they all contain a big subject by definition. That agreement with subject. So again, look at these examples. Poirot believes that himself is the best detective, and Poirot believes that a picture of himself will be on show. You see here, this is ungrammatical because himself should be, should have its antecedent in its domain, but the Poirot is in another sentence, above sentence, so there is no locality condition, and this sentence is ungrammatical. Chomsky proposes that in order for an element, to be able to count as a subject or big subject to determine the binding domain of a reflexive, it must be an accessible subject for that reflexive. A subject is accessible for a reflexive if it is possible to co-index with it, with this reflexive. If we can co-index, this is the index I, you see here, I, this is the little I, you see here, this is the index. If we can co-index these two ones without any problem, we can say that this is, the accessible subject. If we cannot co-index these two ones, so this is not the accessible subject. So what is accessible subject or big subject? A is an accessible subject or big subject for B if the co-indexation of A and B doesn't violate any grammatical principles. For example, here the co-indexation of the reflexive himself and the antecedent Poirot can violate the locality condition, so we cannot co-index these two ones, so this is not the accessible subject of the reflexive. Chomsky proposes that one of the grammatical principles that should be considered, this is another filter, okay, for co-indexation. I within I filter. You see here? We cannot co-index an element within another element. You see here, the goal of the filter is to violate circularity in reference. Okay, we cannot have a kind of circular in any sentence. Okay, we cannot refer co-index one element inside another element. This is the I within I filter. So about the last part of the anaphors, the principle A of binding theory, which talks about the anaphors, is that anaphors can consist of two kind of pronouns: reflexive pronouns like himself, herself, and reciprocals like this pronoun, each other. You see here, look at this example. The students attacked each other. This is kind of reciprocals. The student attacked each other. Each other are ill. You see here, these are kind of reciprocal. The first one is okay because each other, like the reflexive, like himself, needs an antecedent. So the student is its antecedent and can bind each other, and this is okay. We co-index these two one without any problem. The second one, the student attacked each other. You see here, each other is a kind of plural, okay, pronoun. So it needs a kind of plural antecedent. The student here is not plural, so this is ungrammatical. And the other one, each other are ill, each other here needs a kind of antecedent, but there is no antecedent, so this is again ungrammatical. So as I told you, reciprocals are inherently plural and hence needs a plural antecedent for the interpretation. So again, we revise the interpretation of anaphors. An anaphor X must be bound in the minimal domain containing X, that pronoun, X as governor, antecedent, and an accessible subject. So interpretation of anaphors: an anaphor must be bound in its governing category, GC. This is the abbreviation or summary of the governing category. So an anaphor must be bound in its governing category. So this is the principle, A of the binding theory. The second principle of binding theory, as I told you, talks about the pronouns. Okay, for example, look at these two examples. Poirot had hurt him. This is a kind of pronoun. Poirot had hurt himself. This is a kind of reflexive pronoun. In this sentence, we can co-index himself, the reflexive, with Poirot, because the Poirot here is the antecedent of himself, and this is okay. But in the first one, we cannot co-index the Poirot with him because pronoun in its domain should be free. It means that here the Poirot and him, they are not the same person, because him cannot refers back to the Poirot as a pronoun. So whereas the reflexive here, himself, must be bound by the antecedent, the pronoun here, him, must be free. Okay, so this is the principle B of binding theory, which talks about the pronouns. Look at again these examples. I expect him to invite Poirot. This is okay because him here is free. It has the index J and Poirot has the index I. So this is free. They are not co-indexed. The second one, Poirot invited him. If we co-index him with the Poirot, this is ungrammatical. But if the index of him is different from the index of Poirot, and this shows that him is free, this is okay. So this is the interpretation of the sentence. Another one, Miss Marple hurt him, because this is feminine and this is masculine, so him cannot refer back to the Miss Marple, so it is free and it is okay. This sentence is okay. The other one, he has hurt him. If we co-index him with he, so it's not free, it is ungrammatical. But if the index of the him is different from the he and it doesn't come back to the he, the interpretation of him doesn't come back to he, so this is the correct sentence. Look at another one. Poirot thinks that Miss Marple hurt him. You see here, Miss him cannot comes back to the Poirot, and it cannot comes back to the Miss Marple because this is the feminine antecedent. So this sentence is correct because him here is free, okay, according to the principle B of binding theory. The other one, Poirot's sister invited him. Again, this is okay because him cannot comes back to the sister. This is feminine and this is masculine, and it also cannot comes back to the Poirot because sister is the nearest antecedent of him. So again, this sentence is correct. And the last one, Poirot's brother invited him. We cannot co-index him with the brother because this sentence becomes ungrammatical because the pronoun should be free. So if we co-index him with brother, it is ungrammatical. But if we co-index this pronoun with the Poirot, it is correct because him cannot comes back to the Poirot in the first place of the sentence. So this is about the second, principle of binding theory, which talks about the pronouns. And as I told you, the pronoun must be free. We cannot co-index the pronoun with the antecedent in the same place. So interpretation of pronouns. A pronoun must be free in its governing category where A1, the governing category is the minimal domain containing the pronoun, its governor, and accessible subject, and free is not bound. So this is the condition of the interpretation of pronouns according to the binding theory, the principle B of binding theory. And the last principle, principle C of binding theory, which talks about the referential expressions, or the proper names like Poirot, Bertie, and some other names. So referential expressions, or R expressions, constitute the third class of NPs. As the label indicates, these elements are inherently referential. Expressions such as, for example, Poirot and the detective select a referent from the universe of discourse. So they don't need a kind of reference in a sentence because they comes back to the kind of referent in the universe of discourse. Given that our expressions, or referential expressions, have independent reference, they do not need an antecedent. Okay, in fact, they do not tolerate binding from another element. Let us look at some examples. Poirot attacked him. This is a kind of pronoun. And as I told you, pronoun should be free in its domain. So him cannot come back to the Poirot. Okay. The second one, Poirot says that he is living. You see here, again, he is a kind of pronoun, cannot comes back to the Poirot, and this is in another sentence which starts with that, so it cannot comes back to the Poirot. So, and this is a correct sentence. The other one, he says that Poirot is living. Poirot is a kind of referential expression, or R expression, or proper name, so it cannot comes back to the he. So this is free. This should be free. Okay, we cannot co-index it with another element in the sentence, so Poirot cannot comes back to the he. Another one, his brother likes Poirot very much. Again, this is a kind of referential expression. We cannot comes back Poirot not to brother and not to his. So this is free. This should be free in this sentence because it comes back to one person in the universe, not comes back to one word in the sentence. So it should be free in any condition. Or another example, he says that Miss Marple thinks that Jeeves claimed that Poirot is living. You see here, Poirot here is again a kind of R expression, or proper names. it cannot come back to any element in sentence. So we cannot co-index Poirot I here with he here. It becomes ungrammatical. This is a kind of free, okay? Now we cannot co-index it with any element in the sentence. So from the examples above, we conclude that our expressions do not tolerate any A binding. They must be free, in contrast to pronouns which must be free locally but may be bound outside their governing category. Our expressions or proper names must be free everywhere. Okay? So this is the principle of interpretation of our expressions. Our expressions must be free everywhere. Okay, this is the principle C of the binding theory. So they should be, free everywhere in the sentence, and we cannot co-index the R expression with any element in the sentence because they should be free everywhere in the sentence. So this is the principle of principle C of the binding theory, and this is the last principle of binding theory. So we talked about three kinds of principle. Principle A, which talks about the reflexives, principle B, which talks about the pronouns, and principle C, which talks about the or expression, or proper names. These are the principles of binding theory, which I talked about them in detail. And this is at last, this is the summary of the binding theory. Okay, this is the summary of the binding theory. As I told you, binding theory consists of three principles. Principle A, an anaphor, that reflexive or reciprocals like himself or each other, must be bound in its governing category. It means that they need a kind of antecedent which we should co-index the reflexive pronoun or reciprocal pronoun with that antecedent. So this is the principle A. An anaphor must be bound in its governing category. The second one, principle B. A pronoun must be free in its governing category. And as I told you, the pronoun like he or him, doesn't need antecedent in its sentence and in its governing category. So a pronoun must be free in its governing category, in its domain. Okay, this is the principle B. And the principle C says that an or expression, the proper names like Poirot and some other names, must be free everywhere. They should be free everywhere. Okay, they don't need the antecedent in any place in the sentence. It means that we cannot co-index the or expression with any words in the sentence. So these are the principles of binding theory, and this is the summary of the binding theory. Okay, so in this session I talk about the another information about the principle A, reflexive. Then I talk about principle B, the pronouns, and I told you that the pronouns should be free in the governing category. And at last I talked about the principle C, the or expression, and as I told you, the or expression should be free everywhere in the sentence. Okay, I think that's enough for today, and thank you for your attention, and goodbye everybody.